The night before my son's wedding, I discovered that his bride had spent the night with my husband. My heart didn't just break, it stopped. But the most shocking part of this story isn't the betrayal. It's what I chose to do next. I said nothing, and the next day I still showed up to the wedding. If you're wondering why any woman would remain silent after discovering something like that, stay with me, because the truth behind my silence changed everything. And before I begin, if stories about strength, truth, and life lessons for women resonate with you, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Now let me tell you what really happened. My name is Margaret Hayes. I'm 65 years old, a retired family court mediator. For more than 30 years, I sat across tables from couples who were destroying each other in divorce court. I listened to lies, betrayals, confessions, and regrets. People used to tell me I had a strange gift, the ability to stay calm while the world around me was collapsing. I believed it was simply experience, but nothing in my career prepared me for the night my own family became the case I had to solve. My husband, Edward Hayes, is 67 years old. For decades, he built a respected reputation as a real estate developer in our city. People admired him, they trusted him, and for most of our marriage, I did too. Then there is my son, Ethan Hayes. Ethan is 33, a pediatric surgeon who spends his nights saving children who can barely breathe and comforting parents who are terrified of losing them. He is the best part of my life. Kind, honest, and deeply loyal. The kind of man every mother hopes her son will grow into. And 2 days before this story begins, he was preparing to marry the woman he believed was the love of his life. Her name was Lily Dawson. Lily is 30 years old, a lifestyle consultant who built a career helping wealthy clients organize their lives, their homes, and sometimes their public image. She was charming, intelligent, beautiful in a way that made people immediately comfortable around her. When Ethan introduced her to me 2 years ago, she hugged me and said, "I've heard so much about you, Mrs. Hayes." I remember thinking that she looked at people carefully. Not rudely, not obviously, but like someone who was always measuring a room before stepping into it. At the time I thought it was confidence. Now I know it was calculation. The week before the wedding was chaos in our house. Flowers arriving, guests calling. My sister-in-law Caroline Hayes, Edward's younger sister, staying in the guest room while she helped organize family photographs for the rehearsal dinner slideshow. Caroline has always been the family historian. She remembers every birthday, every anniversary, every tiny detail from decades ago. At 59, she still treats family stories like artifacts in a museum. And in a strange way, she was the first person who sensed something wasn't right, though neither of us understood what that feeling meant yet. The night everything changed was a Thursday evening. The wedding was scheduled for Saturday afternoon. Ethan had just finished a long hospital shift and stopped by the house to drop off the wedding programs Lily had designed. He was glowing with that nervous excitement people have right before their life changes forever. "Mom," he said, hugging me in the kitchen, "2 more days. I can't believe this is really happening." I smiled and held him a little longer than usual. Mothers do that sometimes when they sense something is about to shift. "Are you happy?" I asked him. He laughed. "I'm marrying Lily, of course I'm happy." That answer should have comforted me. Instead, something inside my chest tightened. Edward came in from his office around the same time, greeting Ethan with a proud clap on the shoulder. "My son's about to become a married man," he said. They stood there laughing together, father and son, talking about the wedding, the honeymoon in Italy, the house Ethan and Lily planned to buy next year. Watching them felt like standing in the center of a perfect photograph. I had no idea that photograph was about to burn. Around 9 that night, Ethan left to meet Lily for dinner. Edward went upstairs to take a shower. Caroline had already gone to bed. The house fell quiet in that peaceful way it sometimes does late at night. I was cleaning the kitchen when Edward's phone buzzed on the counter. Normally, I wouldn't look. After 40 years of marriage, curiosity about your spouse's phone isn't something that usually crosses your mind. But something about the timing caught my attention. It buzzed again, then again. I picked it up simply to silence the notifications so they wouldn't wake him. The screen lit up, and what I saw didn't just surprise me, it froze my blood. A message preview appeared across the lock screen. "Lily. Last night was a mistake, but I can't stop thinking about you." I stared at the screen for several seconds before my brain even processed what those words meant. My son's fiancé messaging my husband about the night before. My first instinct was disbelief. Phones can be confusing. Maybe the message was old. Maybe it was meant for someone else. Maybe it was a misunderstanding. But then the phone buzzed again. Lily. We can't let Ethan find out. I felt the room tilt slightly. My hands didn't shake. Years of courtroom training had taught me how to stay still when hearing terrible truths. Instead of panicking, I did something very simple. I unlocked the phone. Edward had never hidden his passcode from me, and within seconds I saw enough messages to understand exactly what had happened. Conversations stretching back weeks, private jokes, late-night calls. One photo of them sitting close together in a hotel lounge. And the message that confirmed the worst part of it all: last night was incredible. Last night, the night before, my husband, my son's bride. I closed the phone and placed it exactly where it had been. Then I stood there in the quiet kitchen for a long time. Some people imagine betrayal feels like an explosion. Loud, violent, immediate. But sometimes it feels like absolute silence. A silence so deep you can hear your entire life rearranging itself. In that moment, I had two choices. I could storm upstairs and confront Edward immediately. I could call Ethan and tell him the wedding had to be canceled. I could expose everything in one emotional outburst. But something inside me, the same instinct that had guided me through thousands of mediation cases, whispered something different. Truth does not shout, it waits for the right moment. And as I stood there in that silent kitchen, I realized something else. If what I had seen was only the surface, then the truth underneath might be far worse. I slowly walked upstairs and got into bed beside Edward. He was already asleep, breathing deeply, peacefully, as if nothing in the world had changed. I stared at the ceiling in the dark for hours. Because by morning, I knew exactly what I was going to do. And it was something no one at that wedding would ever expect. Not my husband, not Lily, not even my son. But before I exposed the truth, I needed proof. And the next person I called would help me uncover something far darker than I had imagined. The night I discovered the messages between my husband Edward Hayes and my son's fiancée Lily Dawson, I did something most people would never expect. I didn't cry, I didn't confront him, I didn't wake him up and demand answers. Instead, I waited. Because after 30 years as a family court mediator, I had learned something most people never understand until it is too late. Truth is powerful, but only when it is revealed at the right moment. And that night, lying beside the man I had been married to for 42 years, I realized that what I had seen on his phone might only be the beginning of something much bigger. Edward slept peacefully beside me, breathing slowly as if nothing had changed. But for me, everything had. Every memory from the past 2 years started replaying itself in my mind like a puzzle I had suddenly learned how to solve. The family dinners where Lily laughed a little too easily at Edward's jokes. The times Edward volunteered to help Lily with wedding logistics when Ethan was working long hospital shifts. The strange tension I had occasionally noticed but dismissed as imagination. Suddenly those moments weren't random anymore. They were clues. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I watched the ceiling slowly turn gray as morning approached. By the time the sun began rising, I had already decided what needed to happen next. I needed evidence. Real evidence. Not screenshots from a phone that Edward could later explain away or claim were misunderstandings. I needed the kind of truth that could not be twisted, denied, or hidden, and there was only one person I trusted to help me uncover it. Her name is Clara Whitman. Clara Whitman is 62 years old and was my closest colleague during my years in family mediation. While I specialized in guiding emotional conflicts between families, Clara specialized in the legal side of those conflicts. She is the kind of woman who reads every contract twice and remembers every word people try to hide between sentences. More importantly, Clara is the person I call when I need clarity instead of comfort. At 6 o'clock that morning, I quietly slipped out of bed, got dressed, and drove to the small cafe near the courthouse where Clara and I used to meet before hearings. She was already there when I arrived. Clara always arrives early. It's one of the reasons she has never lost a negotiation. She looked up from her coffee the moment I walked in. "Margaret," she said, immediately noticing something in my face. "You look like you haven't slept." I sat down across from her. "I haven't." Clara waited. She has always understood that silence often encourages people to speak more honestly than questions do. I leaned forward slightly and said the sentence that still felt unreal even as I spoke it aloud. I believe my husband is having an affair with my son's fiancée. Clara blinked once, not dramatically, not emotionally, just once. That was her version of shock. You believe? She asked calmly. Or you know, I reached into my purse and placed my phone on the table. The screenshots I had taken from Edward's phone were still open. Clara studied them quietly for several minutes. Her expression didn't change. But when she finally looked up, her voice had become sharper. This isn't a suspicion, she said. This is evidence. I exhaled slowly. The wedding is tomorrow. Clara leaned back in her chair. Does Ethan know? Ethan Hayes, my son. The boy who used to fall asleep on my shoulder during long car rides. The man who was now preparing to marry the woman who might be betraying him with his own father. I shook my head. No, Clara studied me carefully. And you're not planning to tell him yet? It wasn't a question. I shook my head again. Not until I understand the full truth. Clara nodded slowly. Good, good, I asked. Margaret, she said, leaning forward slightly, if this woman is capable of doing this with your husband before the wedding, then there's a strong chance there's more going on than just an affair. That sentence made something cold move through my chest. What do you mean? Clara folded her hands together. I mean manipulation, I mean financial motives, I mean someone who carefully positioned herself inside your family. She tapped the phone lightly. And if that's true, we need to know before tomorrow. I understood immediately what she was suggesting. How? Clara smiled faintly. I know someone. 2 hours later, I found myself sitting inside a quiet office building downtown meeting a man named Noah Grant. Noah Grant is 48 years old, a digital forensic investigator who specializes in uncovering information people think they've hidden online. He is quiet, observant, the kind of person who listens far more than he speaks. Clara introduced us briefly before placing my phone on the desk. Mr. Grant, she said, we believe there may be more communication between these two individuals than what we currently have. Noah glanced at the screen, then at me. And when do you need answers? I hesitated for only a moment. Before tomorrow afternoon. He didn't look surprised. The wedding, he said calmly. Clara nodded. Noah leaned back slightly and folded his arms. Phones leave trails, he said. Messages, location data, email backups, hotel Wi-Fi logs, financial records. He looked directly at me. If there's something hidden, we'll find it. I felt the first small sense of control return since the night before. How long will it take? Noah checked his watch. Give me until tonight. As Clara and I left the building, she placed a hand on my shoulder. Margaret, she said gently, you're doing the right thing. I nodded, but inside I felt something much heavier. Because if Noah discovered what Clara suspected, the truth might destroy more than just a wedding. That afternoon, I returned home to find the house filled with wedding preparations again. Ethan was in the living room speaking excitedly with Lily about seating arrangements. Lily Dawson stood when she saw me, smiling warmly. Margaret, she said, walking over to hug me, tomorrow is finally here. I hugged her back, calm. Polite, controlled. Yes, I said softly, it is. Across the room, Edward Hayes watched us carefully. For the first time in 40 years, I saw something in his eyes I had never seen before. Fear. And as I stood there between my husband, my son, and the woman about to marry into our family, my phone vibrated quietly in my purse. A message from Noah Grant, 3 simple words. You need to see this. And at that moment, I realized something terrifying. What we had discovered so far was only the surface of the truth. When my phone vibrated in my purse that afternoon and I saw the message from Noah Grant, I felt something inside my chest tighten again. 3 simple words appeared on the screen. You need to see this? In my 30 years mediating family conflicts, I learned that those kinds of messages never bring good news. They bring truth, and truth, when it finally appears, rarely arrives gently. At that moment, I was standing in my own living room watching my son Ethan Hayes and his fiancée Lily Dawson discuss wedding details like 2 people who believed their future was perfectly secure. Ethan looked happy in a way only someone deeply in love can look. He had just finished a long hospital shift and was still wearing his light blue scrubs beneath his jacket. His eyes were tired, but they were bright with excitement. "Mom," he said when he noticed me watching them, "Lily thinks we should move the reception tables closer to the garden doors so people can see the sunset during dinner. What do you think?" I forced a small smile. "I think that sounds beautiful." Lily turned toward me, her smile warm and effortless. She had always been good at that, making people feel included, welcomed, admired. "Margaret," she said gently, "Ethan told me the garden looked amazing when you checked it this morning. I'm so grateful you've helped with everything." I nodded politely. "Of course." Across the room, Edward Hayes, my husband of 42 years, stood near the window pretending to read through a stack of wedding programs. Edward is 67 years old, a man who spent his life building a reputation as a respected real estate developer. Confident, charismatic, the kind of man who always seemed completely in control of every room he entered. But that afternoon, something about him was different. His movements were slower. His eyes kept shifting toward me, then quickly away again. It was the behavior of someone who knows a secret exists but doesn't know how much of it has been discovered. I excused myself quietly and walked upstairs. Once inside my bedroom, I closed the door and opened the message Noah had sent. There was a file attached. My hands remained steady as I tapped the screen, but my breathing had slowed in the way it does when your mind prepares for something difficult. The document opened. At the top was a simple title, Location Records, Lily Dawson and Edward Hayes. My eyes moved slowly down the screen. Date stamps, GPS data, hotel check-ins, private meetings. And then the detail that made everything suddenly feel much darker than I had expected. The meetings between Edward and Lily had not started recently. They had begun 6 months ago, long before the wedding planning began. Long before Ethan had finalized the engagement ring. Long before Lily had even moved into the apartment Ethan had helped her lease downtown. I kept reading. Several hotel visits, 2 private dinners, and one meeting location that made my stomach tighten slightly. A bank office. That detail didn't match the pattern of an affair. That detail suggested something else entirely. My phone rang before I finished reviewing the report. It was Noah. "Mrs. Hayes," he said calmly when I answered. "You saw the file." "Yes." There was a brief pause. "There's more." I sat down slowly on the edge of the bed. "Tell me." Noah's voice remained steady. "The financial activity connected to your husband's accounts shows multiple transfers over the past 4 months. My heart sank slightly. "Transfers to Lily? Not directly," he said. "But the funds were routed through investment consultations tied to a company registered under Lily Dawson's consulting network." My years in mediation had taught me how to recognize manipulation patterns quickly. Affairs happen for many reasons: loneliness, ego, midlife fear. But when money starts moving quietly behind the scenes, something more strategic is usually involved. "How much money?" I asked quietly. Noah hesitated for just a moment. "So far, approximately $200,000. The number echoed in my mind. 200,000. My husband had not only betrayed our family emotionally, he had also begun quietly transferring large sums of money through Lily's professional network. I closed my eyes briefly. "Does Ethan know anything about this?" Noah answered immediately. "No indication that he does." That answer brought a different kind of pain. Because my son Ethan, 33 years old, brilliant pediatric surgeon, the most honest man I know, was preparing to marry a woman who might not only be betraying him with his father, but also positioning herself inside our family finances. "There's one more thing," Noah added carefully. "A message thread between Lily and a colleague was recovered from a deleted email backup." I opened my eyes again. "What does it say?" Noah read slowly. Lily wrote, "Once the wedding happens, everything becomes easier. Ethan trusts me completely and Edward already does." For the first time since this investigation began, I felt something sharp move through my chest. Not panic, not even anger. Something colder, realization. Lily Dawson had not simply fallen into an affair with my husband. She had been managing both relationships carefully, and tomorrow she planned to become legally tied to our family. I ended the call with Noah and sat quietly for several minutes. My mind wasn't racing, it was organizing. Because when truth reveals itself piece by piece, the most important thing is not reacting too quickly. It is understanding the full pattern. A knock on the bedroom door interrupted my thoughts. I opened it to find Caroline Hayes standing there. Caroline is Edward's younger sister, 59 years old, and the unofficial historian of our family. She studies people the way archivists study old letters. Margaret, she said softly, I hope I'm not interrupting. Not at all. She stepped inside and closed the door behind her. Her expression was thoughtful. I've been meaning to mention something strange, she said. About Edward and Lily. My attention sharpened instantly. What do you mean? Caroline sat down slowly. 3 months ago I saw them together at a restaurant downtown. I assumed Ethan was with them, but when I walked closer, they were alone. She watched my face carefully. The conversation looked intimate. I nodded slowly. You never told anyone. It didn't seem like my place, she said quietly. But today, when I saw the way Edward kept avoiding your eyes, I started wondering if something was wrong. I reached over and took her hand gently. Caroline, I said softly, something is very wrong. She studied me for several seconds. You know, don't you? I nodded once. Caroline leaned back in the chair and exhaled slowly. My God. For a moment neither of us spoke, then she asked the question I knew was coming. What are you going to do? I looked toward the window where the afternoon sunlight had begun fading into evening. Tomorrow my son would stand at an altar believing he was marrying the woman he loved. Tomorrow guests would gather to celebrate a family that was already quietly breaking apart. But now I understood something far more important than simple betrayal. This was not only about an affair. This was about deception, carefully planned and patiently executed. I turned back to Caroline. I'm going to let the wedding continue. Her eyes widened. Margaret, not because I accept this, I said calmly, but because the truth deserves witnesses. Downstairs, I could hear Ethan laughing with Lily again, completely unaware of the storm building quietly around him. And as I listened to that sound, I realized something that made the situation even more dangerous than I first believed. Because tomorrow, when the truth finally appeared, it wouldn't just end a wedding. It might destroy my entire family. And I still hadn't decided exactly how that truth would be revealed. After Caroline Hayes, my husband Edward's younger sister, left my bedroom that evening, I sat alone for several minutes staring at the same thought that had been circling my mind all day. Tomorrow was my son Ethan's wedding. Tomorrow he planned to marry Lily Dawson, the woman he believed loved him more than anything. But by that point, I knew something Ethan didn't. Lily wasn't just having an affair with my husband. She had been quietly positioning herself inside our family's financial world for months. And if I revealed the truth too soon, she might still find a way to twist it. I had spent 3 decades in family mediation watching exactly that happen. People caught in lies rarely admit them immediately. They redirect, they deny, they manipulate emotions. And the person who suffers most in those moments is usually the one who deserves the truth the most. My son. So instead of confronting Edward that night, I continued preparing for the wedding. Downstairs, the house was still alive with activity. Ethan and Lily were sitting at the dining table reviewing the final guest list. Ethan looked up when I entered the room. Mom, he said warmly, we were just talking about tomorrow. Lily wants to make sure you're comfortable giving the welcome speech during the reception. Lily smiled sweetly beside him. She had always been very careful about appearing thoughtful and respectful in front of me. Margaret, she said gently, it would mean a lot if you welcomed everyone. After all, you've been the heart of this entire wedding. I studied her quietly for a moment. Lily Dawson was beautiful in the way people notice immediately. Calm eyes, warm voice, a presence that made others trust her quickly. It was easy to see why Ethan had fallen in love with her. But now that I knew what was hidden beneath that charm, every word she spoke sounded different. Of course, I said calmly, I'll say something. Ethan smiled, clearly relieved. You're the best, Mom. I nodded and excused myself again. Upstairs, I called Clara Whitman. Clara answered immediately. Margaret, she said, I was expecting your call. Clara had always understood timing better than most lawyers. She knew that if I hadn't called earlier, it meant something had changed. Noah confirmed everything, I told her quietly. The affair, the money transfers, and messages suggesting Lily planned to secure access to Edward's assets once the wedding happened. Clara was silent for a moment, then she said exactly what I expected. Then the wedding cannot happen. I leaned back against the window and looked out at the quiet street outside our home. The ceremony will happen, I said calmly. Clara sighed softly. Margaret, I know you believe in letting truth appear naturally, but if Ethan marries her, he won't stay married to her. Clara paused. You already have a plan. I have an understanding of how people behave when confronted publicly with evidence. Clara chuckled quietly despite the seriousness of the situation. 30 years of mediation training. Exactly. And what role do I play in this? She asked. I walked slowly across the room and sat at my desk. I want everything prepared legally, financial records organized. Documentation ready if Ethan needs immediate legal protection tomorrow. Clara's voice became sharper. You're planning something during the reception? Yes. Margaret, Clara said carefully, once that moment happens, there's no reversing it. I looked toward the family photographs lining my wall. Ethan as a child, Edward smiling beside us years ago when life was still simple. Some things shouldn't be reversed, I said quietly. After I ended the call, another message arrived from Noah Grant. This time it contained something different. Security footage from a hotel lobby dated 3 weeks earlier. The image was grainy but unmistakable. Edward Hayes walking beside Lily Dawson toward an elevator. Close, comfortable, familiar. My husband and my son's bride moving through the world as if their secret belonged only to them. I closed the file slowly, because at that moment I realized something else. Edward's betrayal was terrible, but Lily's manipulation had been calculated. She had carefully built trust with Ethan, carefully charmed Edward, carefully placed herself inside our family circle. And tomorrow she planned to complete that strategy by marrying my son. I stood and walked downstairs again. Caroline Hayes was in the kitchen preparing tea. When she saw my face, she immediately understood that my thoughts had grown heavier. Margaret, she said gently, I've been thinking about what you told me. I sat down across from her. So have I, Caroline lowered her voice. Do you want me to confront Edward tonight? I shook my head slowly. No, why not? She asked. I folded my hands on the table, because the truth should not appear in whispers behind closed doors. Caroline studied me for a moment, then she smiled slightly. You're going to expose them. I'm going to protect my son. There was a difference. She leaned back in her chair and laughed softly. You always did know how to dismantle a lie with precision. I smiled faintly. That was my profession? Upstairs, Edward's footsteps echoed as he moved through the hallway. For the first time that evening, he entered the kitchen and stopped when he saw Caroline and me sitting together. Everything all right? He asked cautiously. His voice sounded normal, but his eyes kept flicking toward me. I looked at him calmly. Everything is exactly as it should be. Edward nodded slowly, though something in his expression suggested he didn't fully believe me. Big day tomorrow, he said awkwardly. Yes, I replied. It will be unforgettable. Edward hesitated for another moment before leaving the room. Caroline leaned toward me once he was gone. He knows something is wrong, I nodded. Good. Later that night, the house finally grew quiet again. Ethan and Lily had gone back to her apartment so she could prepare for the bridal party gathering in the morning. Edward had retreated to his study, pretending to review business documents. And I sat alone in the living room looking at the wedding program Ethan had printed for the ceremony. His name, Lily's name. Two people about to promise each other honesty and loyalty, promises that one of them had already broken. I closed the booklet gently and stood, because tomorrow morning I would walk into that wedding as the calm, supportive mother of the groom. I would smile, I would greet guests, I would watch my son stand at the altar. And when the right moment arrived, the truth that Edward and Lily believed they had hidden would finally walk into the room, not loudly, not angrily, but clearly enough that no one could ever deny it again. And what happened after that moment would change every life in that room forever. The morning of Ethan's wedding arrived with a strange calm that I will never forget. After decades of working as a family court mediator, I had learned something important about human conflict. The most dangerous storms often begin in perfect silence. And that morning, everything felt silent. I woke before sunrise, made myself a cup of tea, and sat by the kitchen window watching the lights slowly fill the garden. My son Ethan was getting married in just a few hours. Guests were traveling from across the country to witness what they believed would be the beginning of a beautiful marriage. But I knew something they didn't know. The woman walking down that aisle was not the person she claimed to be, and the man who had betrayed our family sat upstairs pretending nothing had happened. At exactly 7:10 a.m., my phone vibrated. It was a message from Noah Grant, the digital investigator who had been quietly helping me uncover the truth. "Final files secured," he wrote. "Everything is verified." Attached were the last pieces of documentation. Messages between Edward Hayes, my husband, and Lily Dawson, my son's bride. Hotel confirmations. Financial transfers. Conversations that made it painfully clear their relationship had not been an accident or a moment of weakness. It had been deliberate, calculated, and for Lily profitable. I closed the files slowly and whispered the same sentence I had repeated to myself since discovering the truth. Truth does not shout, it waits. Downstairs, I heard movement. Ethan entered the kitchen wearing a white shirt and dark trousers, his tie draped loosely around his neck. My son looked nervous but happy, the way people do when they are standing on the edge of what they believe is the most important day of their lives. "Mom," he said with a grin, "I thought you'd still be asleep." I smiled gently. "Mothers don't sleep on their children's wedding days." He laughed and poured himself coffee. "You ready for today?" The question lingered between us for a moment. "Yes," I said calmly, "I'm ready." Ethan stepped closer and hugged me tightly. "I don't say this enough, but thank you for everything. You raised me to understand love. Loyalty, commitment, today means everything to me." His words landed in my chest like stones, because loyalty was exactly what he believed he was about to promise Lily, and loyalty was exactly what she had already betrayed. But I hugged him back and simply said, "You deserve a marriage built on truth." Ethan nodded, assuming I was speaking about his future. A few minutes later, Edward Hayes walked into the kitchen dressed in his perfectly tailored suit. My husband had always known how to present himself well. Confident posture, charming smile, the image of a respectable man. "Big day," he said casually. I looked at him for a moment longer than usual. "Yes," I replied. "A very important day?" He avoided my eyes almost immediately. Edward knew something was wrong. He didn't know exactly what I knew, but he could feel the shift in the air, and that was enough to make him uncomfortable. By late morning, the wedding venue had filled with guests. The ceremony was being held in a beautiful garden estate just outside the city. White chairs lined a long aisle covered with fresh rose petals. Musicians played soft string music as people found their seats. Friends, colleagues, relatives, everyone excited to celebrate Ethan and Lily. I greeted guests warmly, just as the mother of the groom should. No one suspected anything unusual, that was intentional. Across the garden, I noticed Caroline Hayes, Edward's younger sister, watching carefully. When our eyes met, she gave me a small nod. Caroline understood that something serious was unfolding. She didn't know the full plan, but she trusted my judgment. Then I saw Lily Dawson arrive. She stepped out of the bridal suite looking radiant in her wedding gown. Elegant, confident, smiling for photographers. If someone had walked into that garden at that moment, they would have seen a perfect bride preparing to marry a devoted man. But perfection, I had learned long ago, is often the most convincing disguise. Lily approached me gracefully. "Margaret," she said warmly, "I'm so glad you're here early. Everything feels so overwhelming." Her voice carried the same sweetness that had charmed Ethan from the beginning. I studied her face quietly. "Weddings can reveal many things about people," I said calmly. She laughed softly. "I suppose that's true." Then she leaned closer. "After today, we'll officially be family." Her words were almost poetic in their irony. I smiled politely. "Yes, today will make many truths official." Lily seemed slightly confused by my tone, but the wedding coordinator interrupted before she could ask anything further. Guests were being seated. The ceremony was about to begin. Moments later, Ethan stood at the altar beside the officiant. My son looked proud, hopeful, and deeply in love. Watching him there nearly broke my heart, because I knew what the next few hours would bring. The ceremony itself was beautiful. The vows were sincere, at least on Ethan's side. When Lily repeated the promises of loyalty and honesty, I watched Edward carefully. My husband shifted slightly in his seat. His jaw tightened. Somewhere deep inside him, he knew those vows were already lies, but still he said nothing. The officiant smiled and pronounced them husband and wife. Applause filled the garden. Ethan kissed Lily gently while photographers captured the moment everyone believed would begin their future together. And I applauded with everyone else, because the truth was not meant to appear yet. The reception began shortly afterward inside the grand ballroom. Music, laughter, glasses clinking, guests celebrating the newly married couple. Everything looked exactly like a joyful wedding reception should. But inside my purse, I carried something else. Evidence, documentation, truth waiting for the right moment. At one point, Ethan approached me again. "Mom," he said happily, "don't forget you promised to give the welcome speech." I smiled. "I haven't forgotten." Across the room, I noticed Clara Whitman arrive quietly, my old colleague and legal advisor. She gave me a small, reassuring nod. Everything was ready. Noah had also sent confirmation that the digital files could be displayed when needed. The room continued celebrating, unaware of the storm about to arrive. Finally, the moment came. The DJ tapped the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, before dinner begins, we'd like to invite Margaret Hayes, the mother of the groom, to say a few words." Ethan smiled proudly. Lily squeezed his hand. I stood slowly and walked toward the microphone at the center of the ballroom. 150 guests turned their attention toward me. I took a deep breath and looked at my son first, then at Lily, then at Edward. "Good evening," I began calmly. "As Ethan's mother, I've spent many years helping families resolve conflict and understand each other. One thing my career taught me is this: the strongest marriages are built on honesty." Guests nodded politely. Everything still felt like a normal wedding speech. I continued gently, "But honesty requires courage. And sometimes truth arrives when people least expect it." The room grew slightly quieter. I glanced toward Clara and gave a small signal. The projector screen behind the ballroom slowly lit up. At first, it appeared to be a slideshow of wedding photos. But then the first image appeared, a screenshot of messages between Edward Hayes and Lily Dawson. The room went silent instantly. Ethan frowned in confusion. Lily's face turned pale. Edward stood frozen in his chair. I spoke into the microphone calmly. "I spent 30 years helping families confront difficult truths. Today, I must protect my son from one." Gasps spread across the room as the next images appeared. Hotel records, messages, financial transfers, evidence that could not be denied. Ethan looked from the screen to Lily, then to Edward. "What is this?" he whispered. Lily tried to speak. Edward tried to move, but the truth had already arrived. And once truth appears in the light, it cannot be hidden again. What happened next would change our family forever. The moment the evidence appeared on the screen behind me, the entire ballroom seemed to stop breathing. 150 guests who had been laughing and celebrating only seconds earlier now stared in stunned silence at the images unfolding before them. Screenshots of messages between Edward Hayes, my husband, and Lily Dawson, the bride who had just married my son. Hotel confirmations, financial transfers, conversations that revealed a relationship that had been hidden for months. I stood at the microphone calmly, exactly the way I had learned to stand during difficult mediations throughout my career. Because when truth finally enters the room, someone must remain steady. Across the ballroom, my son Ethan looked confused at first. Then slowly, the confusion turned into disbelief. He looked at the screen again, then at Lily, then at Edward. "What is this?" he asked quietly. No one answered immediately. Lily Dawson's face had turned completely pale. The confident, charming bride who had walked down the aisle less than an hour earlier suddenly looked like someone whose carefully built world had collapsed. Edward Hayes, my husband of 42 years, sat frozen in his chair. His reputation, his authority, his carefully maintained image of respectability, all of it was unraveling in front of everyone. I stepped away from the microphone and allowed the room to absorb what it was seeing. Because once people witness truth for themselves, explanations become unnecessary. Ethan stood slowly from his chair. His voice was calm but strained. "Lily, tell me this isn't real?" Lily swallowed and tried to force a smile, but it disappeared almost instantly. "Ethan, I can explain." That sentence, "I can explain," is something I had heard thousands of times during my years mediating family conflicts. It almost always means the person has already lost the truth but hopes to control the narrative. Ethan looked at Edward next. "Dad?" The word sounded heavier than anything else in the room. Edward finally stood. His face was gray, his hands trembling slightly. "Son, this isn't what it looks like." Ethan laughed softly, a sound filled with disbelief. "It looks like my father and my wife have been meeting in hotels." No one moved. Guests watched silently, unsure whether to leave or stay. This was no longer a wedding reception. It had become a moment of reckoning. Lily stepped forward quickly. Ethan, listen to me, this was a mistake. Ethan's eyes hardened. A mistake, he gestured toward the screen. Those messages go back 4 months. Lily's voice trembled. I didn't mean for it to happen. That sentence changed something inside Ethan. You didn't mean for it to happen, but you kept doing it? Edward tried again. Ethan, I take full responsibility. Lily, stop. Ethan's voice cut through the room. For the first time since I had revealed the evidence, my son looked at me. There was pain in his eyes, but also understanding. Mom, you knew, I nodded gently. I discovered the truth 2 days ago. He absorbed that quietly. And you waited until now? Yes. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. Why? This question mattered more than anything else. I stepped closer to him. Because lies hide best in private conversations, I said calmly. Truth needed to stand where no one could deny it. Ethan looked back at the screen again, then at Lily. Is there anything on that screen that isn't true? Lily said nothing. That silence was the only answer he needed. The room filled with murmurs as guests began realizing the full extent of what had happened. Caroline Hayes, Edward's younger sister, stood slowly from her seat and walked toward Ethan. She placed a hand on his shoulder gently. You deserve honesty, she said quietly. Clara Whitman had also moved closer, standing beside me with the calm composure of someone who understood the legal implications already unfolding. Lily finally spoke again. Her voice was desperate now. Ethan, please, we can talk about this privately. Ethan shook his head slowly. You had months to talk honestly. Edward took a step toward his son. Ethan's son, listen. Ethan stepped back immediately. Don't call me that right now. The pain in his voice cut through every person in the room. Edward stopped moving. For the first time in many years, he looked like a man who truly understood the consequences of his choices. Ethan turned to me again. Mom, is this everything? I nodded once. Everything we could verify. Clara added gently, there is additional documentation if you need it. Ethan looked around the ballroom, at the wedding decorations, the flowers, the cake, the guests who had traveled across the country to celebrate something that had never truly existed. Then he reached slowly toward his left hand. He removed the wedding ring Lily had placed there only an hour earlier. The room was so quiet you could hear the ring touch the table as he set it down. This marriage, Ethan said calmly, ends before it even begins. Lily's face collapsed in shock. Ethan, he raised his hand slightly, stopping her. You manipulated my trust, you manipulated my family. Then he turned to Edward. And you destroyed something that can never be repaired? Edward lowered his head. Ethan stepped away from both of them and walked toward the ballroom exit. For a moment, no one followed. I looked at Clara. She nodded once, confirming everything was legally protected. Then I walked after my son. Outside the ballroom, the evening air felt strangely calm compared to the chaos inside. Ethan stood near the garden fountain staring at the water. I approached slowly. For several seconds he said nothing, then he spoke quietly. Mom, I almost built my life on a lie. I placed a hand on his shoulder. But you didn't, he exhaled slowly. If you hadn't done what you did tonight, I would never have known. I looked at him carefully. Truth protects people even when it hurts. Ethan nodded. The lights from the reception hall glowed behind us while the sound of confused voices echoed faintly through the doors. But outside in the quiet garden, something else had begun. Not a celebration, not revenge, something much deeper. The painful beginning of rebuilding a life that had almost been built on deception. And inside that ballroom, Edward Hayes and Lily Dawson were finally facing the consequences of a truth they had believed would never be revealed. But the story of what happened after that night would become even more complicated than anyone expected. When Ethan walked out of the reception hall that evening, the celebration ended instantly. Inside the ballroom, people were still whispering, staring at the frozen screen where the evidence had appeared only minutes earlier. The music had stopped. The wedding cake stood untouched. And the beautiful decorations that Lily Dawson had spent months planning suddenly looked like decorations for a lie. I remained outside with my son for several minutes before anyone else followed. Ethan stood beside the garden fountain, staring down into the water as if he were trying to slow his thoughts. I knew that silence well. In family mediation, I had seen it many times. It is the silence of someone whose trust has been shattered so completely that words cannot reach it yet. Finally, the door behind us opened. Clara Whitman stepped outside first, followed by Caroline Hayes. Clara approached us carefully. "The guests are beginning to leave," she said quietly. "Most of them understand what happened." Ethan nodded slowly without turning around. "Good," he said. "Because I don't want anyone pretending tonight was normal." Clara looked at me. "Legally speaking, you did exactly the right thing. The documentation is clear. The marriage can be annulled immediately." Ethan turned slightly. "Annulled," Clara explained calmly. "The ceremony happened, but because the fraud was exposed immediately, the marriage can be legally invalidated. You won't be tied to Lily in any way." Ethan let out a slow breath. "Good." Caroline stepped forward next. She had been watching Edward inside the ballroom. "Your father hasn't left his chair," she said quietly. "He looks completely broken." Ethan's expression hardened. "He should." The four of us stood there in silence for a moment before the ballroom doors opened again. This time, Edward Hayes walked outside. My husband looked 10 years older than he had that morning. His confident posture was gone. His shoulders were slumped and the embarrassment in his eyes was impossible to hide. He stopped a few feet away from Ethan. "Son," Ethan didn't turn around. "Don't call me that tonight." Edward swallowed. "I know I deserve that." His voice was quiet now, stripped of the authority he had carried for decades as a successful real estate developer. "But you need to understand," Ethan finally faced him. "Understand what?" Edward hesitated. "That I made a terrible mistake." Ethan laughed softly. It was not the laugh of someone amused. It was the laugh of someone realizing how little that explanation meant. "A mistake," Ethan said. "Dad, forgetting a birthday is a mistake." He pointed toward the reception hall behind us. "You slept with the woman I trusted with my life." Edward looked down, unable to meet his son's eyes. "I wasn't thinking clearly." I had heard many people try to explain betrayal over the years. But that phrase, "I wasn't thinking clearly," was one of the weakest explanations of all. Ethan shook his head slowly. "You weren't thinking about me at all?" Lily Dawson finally appeared in the doorway behind Edward. Her wedding dress, which had looked so beautiful only an hour earlier, now seemed painfully out of place in the middle of this disaster. Her makeup was smudged from crying. She stepped outside cautiously. "Ethan, please." Ethan's entire posture stiffened. "No," Lily's voice shook. "You deserve an explanation." Ethan replied quietly, "You had 4 months to explain the truth." She took another step closer. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this." Caroline muttered under her breath, "It never is." Lily looked directly at Ethan now, her desperation obvious. "I was scared," she said. "I didn't know how to stop it." Ethan's voice turned colder than I had ever heard it before. "So you kept doing it." Lily said nothing. The silence between them confirmed everything the evidence had already shown. Edward tried to speak again. "Ethan, Lily isn't the only one responsible." That sentence made Ethan turn sharply toward him. "You're defending her?" Edward quickly shook his head. "No. I'm saying I'm responsible too." Ethan studied him carefully. "You're both responsible." He looked between them both slowly. "But you were my father." That word carried more pain than anger. Edward closed his eyes briefly. "I know." For the first time that evening, I saw something genuine in his face, shame, but shame does not erase consequences. Ethan took a deep breath and looked at me. "Mom, I'm leaving." "Where will you go?" I asked gently. "Anywhere except here tonight." Clara nodded approvingly. "That's probably wise." Ethan turned to Caroline. "Aunt Caroline, can you help my mother get home?" "Of course," she said immediately. Then Ethan looked at Edward one last time. "I don't know what kind of man you are anymore." Edward didn't respond. There was nothing left for him to say. Ethan then turned to Lily. "And you, I hope whatever you were trying to gain from this was worth losing everything." Lily's eyes filled with tears again. But Ethan was already walking away across the garden. I watched him disappear through the gate leading to the parking area. For a moment, none of us moved. Then Caroline spoke quietly. "Margaret, what happens now?" I answered honestly. "Now we rebuild." Edward still stood where Ethan had left him. "Is there any chance you'll ever forgive me?" he asked quietly. I looked at him carefully. After 42 years of marriage, it was strange to realize I no longer recognized the man standing in front of me. Forgiveness, I said calmly, is not the same as trust. Edward nodded slowly as if he understood the difference for the first time. Clara checked her watch. Margaret, we should leave. Tonight has already done what it needed to do. She was right. The truth had been revealed. The lies had been exposed, and the future of our family had changed permanently. As I walked toward the parking lot with Clara and Caroline, I glanced back once more at the reception hall behind us. Only a few hours earlier, it had been filled with celebration. Now it stood quiet, empty, and abandoned. But what none of us realized yet was that the consequences of that night were only beginning. Because the next morning would bring decisions that would change every one of our lives even more than the wedding itself. The morning after Ethan's wedding was supposed to be the beginning of a new life for him. Instead, it became the morning our entire family faced the consequences of the truth that had been revealed the night before. I woke early just as I always did and sat quietly at the kitchen table with a cup of tea. The house was silent. Too silent. 42 years of marriage had filled that house with routine sounds, Edward reading the newspaper, Ethan moving through the kitchen when he visited, conversations about work and family. But that morning there was nothing, and strangely the silence felt honest. Around 9 o'clock my phone rang. It was Ethan. His voice sounded tired but steady. "Mom, how are you feeling?" I asked gently. There was a long pause before he answered. "Like my life exploded yesterday, but at least I know the truth." That sentence told me something important. My son was hurting, but he wasn't broken. "Where are you?" I asked. "At the hospital," he said. "I couldn't sleep, so I came in early. Being here helps me think." Ethan had always been that kind of person. When life became difficult, he focused on helping others. It grounded him. "Clara told me the annulment process can start today," he continued. "I want it finished as quickly as possible." "It will be," I assured him. Clara already prepared the documentation. He was quiet again for a moment before asking the question I knew would come eventually. "Mom, do you regret how everything happened?" I looked out the window at the morning sunlight touching the garden. "I regret that you were hurt," I said calmly, "but I do not regret telling the truth." Ethan exhaled slowly. "Neither do I." That answer told me he understood something many people never do. Truth can be painful, but lies are far more destructive in the long run. Later that afternoon, Clara Whitman arrived at my house with the legal documents. She placed them carefully on the table. "The annulment filing is ready," she said. "Lily Dawson won't have much room to contest it. The evidence is overwhelming." I nodded. "Has she contacted Ethan?" Clara shook her head. "Not directly. But her lawyer reached out this morning." And Clara adjusted her glasses slightly. "Apparently Lily has already left the city." That surprised me slightly. "Left, yes. According to her attorney, she intends to avoid further publicity." I wasn't surprised by that. People who build their lives on manipulation rarely stay where their lies have been exposed. Clara looked at me carefully. "Margaret, there's another matter." I knew what she meant before she said the name. "Edward," Clara nodded. "He contacted me this morning. He's prepared to sign separation papers immediately." The words hung in the air for a moment. 42 years of marriage reduced to a simple legal process. "Did he say anything else?" I asked quietly. Clara hesitated before answering. "He said he knows he destroyed his family." I sat down slowly. It is a strange thing to realize that someone you once trusted completely has become a stranger. Later that evening, there was a knock at my door. When I opened it, Edward Hayes stood there. He looked older than I had ever seen him. Not physically, but emotionally. "Margaret," he said quietly. I stepped aside and allowed him inside. Not because I trusted him anymore, but because some conversations must happen face to face. We sat across from each other in the living room where we had once celebrated birthdays, anniversaries, and family holidays. Edward spoke first. "I deserve everything that happened yesterday." I didn't respond immediately. Over the years, I had learned that people often rush to defend themselves when confronted. Edward wasn't doing that. "I destroyed Ethan's trust," he continued. "And yours?" "Yes," I said calmly. He looked down at his hands. "I can't undo what I did." "No," I replied. "You can't." Edward nodded slowly. "Clara told me you're filing for separation." "Yes." There was no anger in my voice anymore, just clarity. "You're right to do it," he said quietly. That moment was the first time I truly believed he understood the consequences of his actions. Edward looked around the room slowly. I built this house thinking it would hold our family together forever, I answered honestly. Houses don't hold families together, trust does. Edward closed his eyes briefly. Is there any chance someday you could forgive me? That question is one people often misunderstand. Forgiveness is not the same as restoring a relationship. Forgiveness takes time, I said calmly. And trust may never return. Edward nodded. I understand. He stood slowly. I'll sign whatever Clara sends. Before leaving, he paused at the door. Margaret, despite everything, thank you for protecting Ethan. I didn't answer. Because protecting my son had never been something that required gratitude. It was simply what a mother does. 2 weeks later, Ethan came home for dinner. The exhaustion in his face had begun to fade. The annulment is final, he told me as we sat at the kitchen table. Legally, the marriage never existed. I nodded gently. And emotionally, he thought for a moment before answering. Emotionally, it will take time. That was the honest answer. Ethan smiled faintly. But I'm grateful you showed the truth when you did. Truth always arrives eventually, I said. I just made sure it arrived before your life was built on a lie. Months passed. Slowly, life settled again. Ethan returned fully to his work at the hospital. Edward moved into a smaller apartment across town. And I began learning something new about my own life. Sometimes the end of one chapter is simply the clearing of space for something better. One evening, as I sat on the porch watching the sunset, Caroline Hayes joined me with 2 cups of tea. You know, she said thoughtfully, people in the family are still talking about that wedding. I smiled slightly. Families always talk. Caroline looked at me curiously. Do you ever wish you had handled it differently? I shook my head slowly. No, she raised an eyebrow, not even a little. I answered with the belief that had guided my entire career. Truth does not shout, I said quietly. It waits for the right moment. And sometimes that moment changes everything.